December 6, 1917, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Captain Aimé Le Medec stood on the bridge of the Mont Blanc watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the harbour. The French cargo vessel had arrived the previous evening, her holds packed with a cargo so dangerous that even seasoned mariners would have refused to sail with it. But this was wartime, and the Great War demanded risks that peacetime captains would never consider. What Le Medec could not have known as he gazed across the calm waters of Halifax harbour was that in less than 30 minutes his ship would create the largest man-made explosion in human history. An explosion so powerful it would flatten entire neighbourhoods, hurl a ship's anchor nearly 2 miles inland, and kill more than 1,900 people in an instant. The blast would be felt 100 miles away, and its mushroom cloud would rise a mile into the sky, foreshadowing the atomic age that lay 3 decades in the future. But before we witness this catastrophic moment that changed Halifax forever, we need to understand how 2 ships on a routine morning became the instruments of unprecedented destruction. Because what happened in Halifax harbour wasn't just an accident, it was the culmination of wartime desperation, bureaucratic confusion, and a series of decisions that transformed a busy port into ground zero for devastation beyond imagination. The story begins not in Halifax, but in the trenches of France, where the Western Front had devolved into a bloody stalemate. By December 1917, the war had consumed millions of lives and vast quantities of ammunition. The Allied forces were burning through explosives at rates that strained global production. Every shell, every mine, every pound of TNT had to be manufactured, transported, and delivered to the front lines through a supply chain that stretched across oceans. Halifax had become a critical link in this chain. The port city on Canada's Atlantic coast served as the primary departure point for convoys heading to Europe. Ships would arrive from across North America, loaded with grain, steel, ammunition, and men, then form protective convoys for the dangerous Atlantic crossing. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, turning every voyage into a deadly gamble. But the convoys offered safety in numbers, and Halifax provided the staging ground where individual vessels became part of these protective formations. On December 5, 1917, the Mont Blanc arrived in Halifax, carrying perhaps the most dangerous cargo ever assembled on a single vessel. Captain Le Medec had sailed from New York with his ship's holds crammed with 2,925 tons of explosives. The manifest read like a recipe for apocalypse. In the forward hold sat 2,300 tons of picric acid, a yellow crystalline compound used in high explosive shells. The stuff was so volatile that even minor impacts could trigger detonation. Behind that lay 200 tons of TNT, the military explosive that had revolutionized warfare since its invention 2 decades earlier. But the most dangerous cargo wasn't in the holds at all. Strapped to the Mont Blanc's deck were hundreds of barrels containing benzol, a highly flammable petroleum product used as fuel for military vehicles. The barrels covered the ship's deck like a forest of potential firebombs, each one capable of spreading flames across the entire vessel in minutes. Any sailor with experience would have recognized the setup as a floating bomb waiting for a spark. The Mont Blanc's arrival had been delayed by rough weather, causing her to miss the convoy she was supposed to join. Now Le Medec faced a dilemma that would prove fatal. Halifax harbour was protected by submarine nets that were opened twice daily to allow ships to enter and exit. The morning opening had already passed, meaning the Mont Blanc would have to wait until evening to leave the harbour and join the next available convoy. This delay violated one of the most basic safety protocols for ships carrying dangerous cargo. Vessels loaded with explosives were supposed to transit Halifax harbour as quickly as possible, minimising their time in the crowded port. But wartime schedules were unforgiving, and the convoy system took precedence over individual safety concerns. Le Medec anchored his floating arsenal in the harbour's Bedford Basin, surrounded by dozens of other vessels, cargo warehouses and residential neighbourhoods. Meanwhile, another ship was approaching Halifax from the opposite direction. The Immo was a Norwegian vessel chartered by the Commission for Relief in Belgium, carrying supplies for civilians caught in the war zone. Unlike the Mont Blanc, the Immo carried no explosives, but her arrival would prove equally catastrophic. Captain Håkon From commanded a vessel that was already behind schedule, having been delayed by bureaucratic issues with her cargo clearance. The Immo represented one of the war's more noble endeavours. The Commission for Relief in Belgium, led by future US President Herbert Hoover, was attempting to feed millions of civilians trapped in German-occupied territory. These relief ships carried a special status that allowed them to pass through combat zones without interference from either side. But this neutrality came with strict scheduling requirements, and any delays could jeopardize the entire relief operation. As December 6th dawned clear and cold, both ships were preparing to move through Halifax harbour's narrow channel. The Mont Blanc needed to reach the convoy assembly point outside the harbour. The IMO needed to exit Halifax and begin her journey to New York to collect relief supplies. Both captains were operating under pressure, dealing with tight schedules and the constant stress of wartime navigation. Halifax harbour itself contributed to the danger. The port featured a narrow channel called the Narrows that forced all ship traffic through a bottleneck, barely 400 yards wide. Ships entering and leaving the harbour had to navigate this confined space while following complex traffic rules designed to prevent collisions. Incoming vessels were supposed to keep to the starboard side, while outgoing ships maintained the port side. But these rules assumed normal peacetime conditions, not the chaos of wartime shipping. The harbour pilot system added another layer of complexity. Local pilots who knew the harbour's dangers were required to board incoming ships and guide them safely to anchorage. These pilots understood the currents, the shoals, and the traffic patterns that made Halifax navigation treacherous. But the war had stretched the pilot system beyond its limits. Too many ships, too few pilots, and too much pressure to maintain impossible schedules. At 8:45 a.m., both ships entered the Narrows from opposite directions. The Mont Blanc was heading outbound, loaded with her deadly cargo and guided by harbour pilot Francis Mackey. The IMO was coming inbound, her captain anxious to clear the harbour formalities and begin loading relief supplies. What happened next would unfold with the terrible inevitability of a Greek tragedy, each decision logical in isolation but collectively steering toward catastrophe. The ships first spotted each other at a distance of about a mile. Both captains had time to assess the situation and take corrective action. Both vessels were travelling at moderate speeds, giving their crews precious minutes to avoid collision. The rules of navigation were clear, the channel was wide enough for safe passage, and experienced mariners commanded both ships. But a series of miscommunications and misunderstandings began to compound. The IMO was slightly off course, positioned closer to the centre of the channel than regulations required. The Mont Blanc's pilot, following standard procedure, signalled his intentions with the ship's whistle. One blast meant he intended to pass starboard to starboard, the normal traffic pattern. But the IMO's response suggested confusion about the Mont Blanc's intentions. Captain From ordered his ship to maintain course, believing the Mont Blanc would adjust to avoid collision. Captain Le Medec, seeing the IMO's position, realised that standard passing procedures might not work. The Norwegian vessel appeared to be crowding the centre of the channel, leaving insufficient room for safe passage. Pilot Francis Mackey felt the tension building on the Mont Blanc's bridge as the distance between the ships continued to shrink. He had guided vessels through these waters for over 2 decades, navigating everything from luxury liners to military transports through the Narrows. But never had he felt the weight of responsibility that pressed down on him this morning. Below his feet lay enough explosive power to level half of Halifax, and directly ahead steamed a ship that seemed determined to maintain a collision course. The whistle signals between the vessels grew more frantic. 3 sharp blasts from the IMO indicated emergency manoeuvres. 2 long blasts from the Mont Blanc signalled desperate attempts to coordinate passage. But the acoustic chaos of the busy harbour meant that whistle signals often went unheard or misinterpreted. Steam engines, cargo operations, and the general din of port activity created a wall of sound that swallowed crucial communications. Captain Le Medec watched the IMO's approach with growing alarm. The Norwegian vessel was not just maintaining course, she was actually moving toward the Mont Blanc's intended path. What Le Medec could not know was that the IMO's steering had been compromised by her interaction with other vessels earlier that morning. A tugboat had been blocking her path, forcing Captain From to navigate around the obstruction and leaving his ship positioned awkwardly in the channel. The rules of maritime navigation are written in the blood of previous disasters. Ships approaching each other head-on are required to alter course to starboard, passing port side to port side. But these rules assume clear communication, adequate sea room, and vessels operating under normal conditions. None of these assumptions applied in Halifax harbour on the morning of December the 6th. At 8:50 a.m, with the ships now less than half a mile apart, both captains made decisions that sealed their fate. Captain From, believing he had the right of way, and seeing what appeared to be adequate space, ordered his engines full ahead. He intended to power past the Mont Blanc before the French ship could cross his bow. The manoeuvre might have worked under different circumstances, but it failed to account for the Mont Blanc's own evasive actions. Captain Lemedic, recognizing that standard passing procedures had failed, ordered his ship hard to starboard. The move was intended to swing the Mont Blanc's bow away from the approaching Imo, creating additional separation between the vessels. But the sharp turn also brought the Mont Blanc's stern directly into the Imo's path, transforming what might have been a glancing bow contact into a devastating broadside collision. Pilot Mackie shouted orders to the engine room demanding emergency reverse power. The Mont Blanc's engines screamed as they fought to slow the vessel's forward momentum. Black smoke poured from the funnel as stokers threw everything they had into the boilers, trying to generate the power needed for the emergency manoeuvres. But ships are not automobiles. They cannot stop on command or change direction instantly. The laws of physics and the momentum of 3,000 tons of cargo made the collision inevitable. The Imo's bow struck the Mont Blanc at 8:52 a.m. with the grinding shriek of steel against steel. The impact occurred amidships on the Mont Blanc's starboard side, precisely where the most dangerous cargo was stored. The collision tore a gaping hole in the French vessel's hull, exposing the volatile cargo to air and creating the conditions for immediate ignition. But the collision itself was survivable. Ships had collided in Halifax harbour before without catastrophic consequences. What transformed this maritime accident into history's greatest man-made explosion was the cargo configuration that had been deemed acceptable by wartime necessity. The benzol barrels strapped to the Mont Blanc's deck had been designed for easy loading and transport, not collision resistance. The impact ruptured dozens of these barrels, spilling highly flammable petroleum products across the Mont Blanc's deck and into her damaged hull. The benzol created an immediate fire hazard, its vapours mixing with air to form an explosive atmosphere around the ship. Any spark, any source of ignition, would turn the vessel into an inferno within seconds. That spark came from the collision itself. The grinding metal contact between the ship's hulls generated a shower of sparks that fell directly onto the spilled benzol. The petroleum ignited instantly, creating a wall of flame that raced across the Mont Blanc's deck and down into her holds. Within minutes, the French vessel had become a floating bonfire, her superstructure silhouetted against flames that reached toward the morning sky. The Mont Blanc's crew recognized the danger immediately. These men had sailed with explosive cargo before, and they understood that their ship had become a ticking bomb. Captain Lemedic ordered abandon ship without hesitation, knowing that his crew had perhaps 10 minutes to escape before the fire reached the massive quantities of TNT and picric acid stored below decks. The crew's evacuation was swift and professional. Lifeboats were lowered and filled within minutes as flames spread across their ship. The men rowed desperately toward the Dartmouth shore, shouting warnings to anyone who would listen. But their French-accented English was difficult to understand, and their warnings about explosives sounded like the panicked cries of sailors fleeing an ordinary ship fire. Meanwhile, the Imo had suffered her own damage from the collision. The Norwegian vessel's bow was crumpled and taking on water, but she remained seaworthy. Captain From ordered his ship away from the burning Mont Blanc, recognizing that proximity to a ship fire posed additional dangers, but he had no idea that his vessel had just triggered the fuse on history's largest pre-atomic explosion. The burning Mont Blanc drifted toward Halifax's waterfront, pushed by wind and current toward Pier 6, where stevedores were already beginning their morning work. The ship's unmanned wheel had been knocked askew by the collision, leaving her rudder locked in a position that aimed her directly at the city's industrial district. Flames rose higher with each passing minute, fed by the benzol and beginning to penetrate the ship's internal structure. Halifax residents gathered along the waterfront to watch what appeared to be an impressive but controllable ship fire. Children on their way to school stopped to observe the spectacle. Workers paused in their morning routines to witness the burning vessel's approach. Telegraph operators began sending routine reports about a harbour collision and resulting fire, treating the incident as newsworthy but not catastrophic. The Richmond district, Halifax's industrial heart, lay directly in the Mont Blanc's path. This neighbourhood housed the city's working families, their modest homes built close together along narrow streets that climbed the hillside from the harbour. The area's residents had grown accustomed to the sounds and sights of wartime shipping. Ships arrived and departed at all hours, their cargo operations creating a constant background of industrial activity. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for what approached their shores that December morning. The Mont Blanc continued her deadly drift, flames now reaching her masts and beginning to heat the steel plates that protected her explosive cargo. Deep in the ship's holds, temperatures were rising toward the ignition point of military explosives designed to destroy enemy fortifications. At approximately 9:04 a.m., nearly 12 minutes after the collision, the fire reached the Mont Blanc's forward magazine where 2,300 tons of picric acid waited in wooden crates. The high explosive had been packed for transport, not for stability, and the rising temperatures had already begun to break down the chemical compounds that kept the material stable. The explosion that followed defied every scale that human beings had developed to measure destruction. The detonation began as a white-hot flash that instantly vaporized the Mont Blanc and everything within a quarter-mile radius. The explosion released energy equivalent to 2,900 tons of TNT, creating a fireball that reached temperatures of 5,000 degrees Celsius. The blast wave expanded outward at over 3,000 feet per second, faster than the speed of sound, which meant the destruction arrived before the thunderous roar that would be heard across 3 provinces. In the first millisecond, the explosion created a vacuum that sucked air, debris, and human beings toward the center of the blast before hurling them outward again with unimaginable force. The Mont Blanc's anchor shank, weighing over half a ton, was launched nearly 2 miles inland, where it embedded itself in the ground like a massive spear thrown by an angry god. Her anchor chain, each link weighing dozens of pounds, was scattered across Halifax like deadly confetti. The pressure wave that radiated from the explosion site carried a force of over 1,000 pounds per square inch. To put this in perspective, a hurricane produces wind pressures of perhaps 2 pounds per square inch. Buildings designed to withstand Atlantic storms crumbled like sandcastles before this invisible hammer of compressed air. The wave travelled at supersonic speed, meaning structures were destroyed before their occupants could hear the explosion that killed them. Richmond District took the full brunt of the blast. Entire city blocks vanished in seconds, their wooden frame houses reduced to splinters and dust. The Hillis Foundry, a massive industrial complex employing hundreds of workers, disappeared completely. Where moments before had stood a thriving neighbourhood of shops, schools and family homes, nothing remained but a crater and scattered debris. The explosion had created an instant wasteland stretching over a square mile. The Protestant orphanage on K Street housed 27 children when the blast wave struck. The 3-story brick building collapsed instantly, burying everyone inside under tons of rubble. Only one child, a 7-year-old girl found days later in the basement, survived the catastrophe. Her rescue became one of the few bright moments in a tragedy that claimed entire families without distinction of age or circumstance. Richmond School had just begun morning classes when the explosion occurred. The building contained nearly 500 students and teachers going about their daily routines. The blast wave arrived without warning, pancaking the structure and trapping everyone inside. Of the school's population, fewer than a dozen survived, most of them students who happened to be near windows that blew outward instead of collapsing inward. The death toll at Richmond School alone exceeded the casualties of many military battles, but the explosion's effects extended far beyond the immediate blast zone. The pressure wave continued outward, weakening with distance but retaining enough force to cause massive damage throughout Halifax and the surrounding area. Windows shattered in buildings 10 miles away. The shock was felt in Truro, 60 miles distant, where residents initially thought they were experiencing an earthquake. The explosion generated a tsunami that raced across Halifax harbour, lifting ships like toys and hurling them onto shore. The wave reached heights of 60 feet in some areas, completely submerging piers and waterfront installations. Vessels anchored safely in Bedford Basin were picked up and deposited hundreds of yards inland. The harbour itself was transformed into a cauldron of debris-filled water that made rescue operations nearly impossible. Above the devastation, a mushroom cloud rose nearly a mile into the sky, its dark mass visible from dozens of miles away. The cloud contained pulverized concrete, wood fragments, human remains, and the vaporized remnants of 2 ships. This ominous pillar would become the first mushroom cloud in human history, a grim preview of the atomic age that would dawn 3 decades later with even more devastating results. The sound of the explosion travelled far beyond its physical effects. People in Prince Edward Island, over 100 miles away, heard what they described as the loudest noise they had ever experienced. In New Brunswick, residents thought they were under attack by German forces. The blast was recorded by seismographs as far away as Boston, and felt by observers in Sydney, Cape Breton, nearly 200 miles from Halifax. In the immediate aftermath, survivors emerged into a landscape that resembled the surface of an alien planet. Where familiar neighbourhoods had stood, nothing remained but smoking rubble and scattered debris. The explosion had created its own weather system, generating winds that fanned dozens of fires throughout the devastated area. Black smoke rose from hundreds of burning buildings, creating a pall that blocked out the morning sun. The human cost became apparent as rescue workers began searching through the wreckage. Bodies were found blocks away from their homes, hurled by the blast wave and often mutilated beyond recognition. Entire families had been wiped out instantly, leaving no survivors to mourn their passing. The explosion had been so sudden and complete that many victims never knew what killed them. Medical facilities throughout Halifax were overwhelmed within hours. The city's hospitals themselves damaged by the blast faced an impossible task. Hundreds of injured people arrived simultaneously, many suffering from injuries that doctors had never seen before. The explosion had created wounds unlike anything in medical experience, combining blast trauma, burns, and injuries from flying debris into cases that challenged every available treatment. The Halifax School for the Blind had been conducting morning classes when windows throughout the building exploded inward. Glass fragments blinded dozens of children and teachers who had possessed normal vision moments before. The irony was lost on no one. An institution dedicated to helping the blind had become a factory for creating new cases of blindness through flying glass and debris. Railway stations throughout the maritime provinces began receiving desperate telegrams requesting medical supplies, doctors, and emergency assistance. The scale of the disaster quickly became apparent to authorities across eastern Canada. This was not a local accident requiring modest assistance, but a catastrophe that had effectively destroyed a major city and would require unprecedented relief efforts. The explosion had severed Halifax's connections to the outside world. Telegraph lines were down, telephone service was interrupted, and the railway station had been severely damaged. For several hours after the blast, the rest of Canada had no clear picture of what had happened in Halifax. Initial reports spoke of a ship collision and fire, but the true scale of destruction would not become apparent until rescue teams arrived from outside the city. Weather conditions complicated the disaster response. December in Halifax meant short days, freezing temperatures, and the constant threat of winter storms. Survivors found themselves exposed to harsh conditions without adequate shelter, medical care, or basic necessities. Many who survived the initial blast would die from exposure, untreated injuries, or the collapse of damaged buildings in the hours and days that followed. The explosion had created thousands of refugees in their own city. People who had lived comfortable middle-class lives found themselves homeless and destitute within minutes. Families were separated in the chaos, children lost their parents, and parents searched desperately for missing children among the ruins. The social fabric of an entire community had been torn apart by a single catastrophic moment. Among the debris and destruction, stories of remarkable survival began to emerge. A baby found alive in the ruins of a collapsed house, protected by the body of his mother, who had shielded him with her life. A family cat that led rescuers to survivors trapped beneath their destroyed home. A postman who continued delivering mail through the devastated areas, believing that maintaining normal routines might help preserve some sense of community continuity. But for every story of miraculous survival, there were dozens of tales of loss that defied comprehension. The Orr family lost 6 children in their collapsed home. The Liggins family was wiped out entirely when their house took a direct hit from flying debris. Entire streets of families were erased from existence, their stories ending in an instant of unimaginable violence. The disaster had transformed Halifax from a thriving wartime port into a scene from humanity's darkest nightmares. But the full scope of the tragedy was still unfolding as rescue workers began the grim task of searching for survivors among the ruins. The Halifax explosion stands as a stark reminder that in warfare, the most devastating casualties often occur far from the battlefield itself. 2 ships, each following wartime orders, each commanded by experienced mariners, each carrying cargo deemed essential to the war effort, collided in a moment that transformed an entire city into ground zero for unprecedented destruction. The disaster claimed more lives in a single instant than many military campaigns, proving that the Great War's reach extended into every harbour, every neighbourhood, and every family across the globe.